variety of topics that particularly are important and I think interesting to business people in the Valley. And our next program with the partnership is on June 13th on healthcare, both at the local and the state and the national level, but primarily focused at the local and state level. And we'll have the heads of Vail Health, Humana, who else, Chris? Kaiser Permanente, as well as Centura, as well as some state representatives to talk about that. So we're very excited about that. And our other program with the partnership is on October 3rd, and it's on the state of the Valley with local business leaders. So we're very appreciative of our relationship with the partnership. We couldn't do any of this without the support of our sponsors and our underwriters. Tickets cover about 15% of the costs for us to bring almost 45 to 50 programs a year and to keep them affordable. So we're indebted to all of our donors, and I want to just recognize a few. I want to thank the town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily. Our hotel partners are the Antlers at Vail and the Hotel Talisa. I also want to thank the Frechette Family Foundation and Dale and Jeannie Mosier, who've underwritten our entire season of programs. Could we give them all a round of applause? At the end of the program, when we get to the Q&A section, I'll bring this microphone around and I'll hand it to you. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll bring it to you after the person asks the question. I'll bring it to the next person so we can go quickly and not have to wait in between. You may not think you need the microphone, but if you're in the front, the people in the back can't hear your question. Also, we're videotaping the program, so it's really important that we get it on the microphone. And as always, I say that in the effort of trying to get to as many questions, please try to keep your question an actual question and make it concise. Because sometimes it can go off and it's not really helpful for anybody. So thanks for letting me be blunt. I'm going to turn this over to Chris Romer, who's the head of the Vail Valley Partnership. Thank you so much for coming.
And one point of clarification for Chris. I think the summer season starts on June 1st, not December 6th, or June 6th, not December 6th. Did I say December? I think you said December. I heard December, and I value my summers. So we're gonna call it June 6th for summer, and next winter we're gonna have another great snow year. It will be nothing like summer. So, and for those enjoying the spring weather, we have a bomb cyclone coming, so wear your jacket, Bob. No short sleeves tomorrow or Thursday. So thank you. I'm Chris Romer with Vail Valley Partnership. We appreciate you guys taking time out of your schedule to join us, and we appreciate our speakers and panelists today. Our format, you're going to hear from Jonathan and Amy talking about the issue, and of course the issue today is immigration and the Vail Valley. I think they'll talk about things from a 30,000 foot level and how it impacts us, and then we'll have our local business panelists, Gary from Gallegos Corp and Jen from Vail Resorts, to share their feedback from a local perspective. So really trying to take that, what you hear in the news, what you see in the news, and the policy driven, and then what it really means to our local community here. With that, I'll introduce Jonathan and have him come up. We're going to have them do self-introductions. They can do that a little easier than I can and a little better, and it's a better use of everybody's time for that. So Jonathan, thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Grode. I am visiting you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I run an immigration firm called Green and Spiegel. And we deal with clients all over the country because immigration, unlike other areas of law, is federal, right? So it's controlled by federal laws, and that's why the current administration has so much impact over what is happening. In addition to running the firm, I teach as an adjunct professor of law at Temple University. And on a personal note, this is amazing that you guys have a program like this. I can say we don't really have something this centralized in Philadelphia geared towards education about the community and the region the same way you do here. We have a lot of disparate groups that all have their own interests, but to have something for everybody to come to is pretty remarkable. So I'm really honored to be here and part of it. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about and why, and then Amy's going to come and chat to you a little bit about a visa that's very particular to this region and how it functions, And then you'll hear from me again talking about enforcement trends and some of the stuff that you hear on the news, which may be confusing, or you read tweets about and you don't really know what it means. So we're going to try to clear up some of that confusion with actual stories of how things are impacted. But, this is like a lawyer disclaimer thing. You can ignore that. All right. I think it's really important to have a little bit of perspective when it comes to immigration. Because for the first time in a long time, it's become very politicized, and each party is kind of taking its stance. Now, I think it's really important to note that I am a registered independent. I have no political affiliation myself, and it's because of immigration. And if you look at the history of the past administrations, you actually start to see why. So the last time we had any meaningful change to the immigration laws was in 1986. That's the last time we had comprehensive immigration reform. And that was the last time we actually had an amnesty. And who was in office was a Republican by the name of Ronald Reagan. And what he tried to do was create responsibilities for employers to ensure the legality of their workforce. So it used to just be the obligation of the government. They would come in and they would see if people had status or didn't have status. For the first time ever, it became the obligation of the employer. And when you hear me talk about things later, that's what we're going to be focusing on. And he also tried to create a year-round low-skilled visa classification. Now, Amy's going to talk to you about temporary low-skilled visa classifications, which are critical to the economy of this area. But year-round low-skilled visas was something that was proposed by the Republican administration, but was actually blocked by the Democrats. Because the unions, who were big supporters of the Democrats, had a very protectionist view of jobs, right? That was the whole thing. We want to protect, we want to protect, we want to protect. Which kind of, you fast forward to today's rhetoric coming from the White House, and it sounds eerily familiar to what the Democrats were saying in the 80s. And it's fascinating to see the change. But that was blocked. Now, Reagan famously said, with the passage of this legislation, we will have no more illegal immigration to the United States. Right now, there's 11 million undocumented workers in the United States. 8 million of them are here primarily for employment purposes to fulfill year-round low-skilled jobs. 8 million. That is considered to be 5% of our total labor force. There are people who are coming here for economic reasons without a mechanism to actually do so illegally. And I want you to keep that in mind when we come back and we talk about enforcement later. Then, under Bush, both Bushes actually kind of fall into favor together because they were really big advocates of immigration through employment. And we had a series of trilateral and bilateral free trade agreements that specifically created special visa classifications. You guys all know about NAFTA, right? Which is now going to be called the USMCA. It just rolls right off the tongue. But that created a special visa classification so people could come in for specific purposes from Canada and Mexico. But little do you know, or most people know, that we have bilateral free trade agreements with Chile, Singapore, and Australia. And those nationalities have special visa classifications that were all promoted through Republican administrations by trade agreements. And this administration says, we don't want any trade agreements at all. You know, they pulled out of the Pacific Trade Agreement. They tried to renegotiate NAFTA. It's still up for vote in Congress. Clinton expanded H-1B visas tremendously because of the dot-com era. But he also had a very restrictionist view on immigration in a lot of ways. It was the first time ever that we saw I-9 enforcement, which talks about worksite compliance and who's legally allowed to work. But under Clinton, we also had the passage of DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, which made it so that if you were a foreign national, even if your home country same-sex marriage was legal, we would not recognize it in the United States. And that happened under a Democrat administration. Now, Bush changed the dynamic. We had some free trade agreements, but he moved the needle in terms of worksite enforcement. And that's where we started seeing raids. And that's where they would come to your work site, they would round everybody up, and they'd say, show me your papers. The largest raid in the history of the United States happened under W. Bush's administration in 2008, where 400 people were arrested. Later, you will hear me tell you about the second largest raid that occurred last week. Bush also tried to have comprehensive immigration reform in 2007. It failed. Obama, among immigration advocates, believe it or not, was known as the deporter-in-chief. The highest level of people being removed from the United States was under the Obama administration, until this administration. And they had a heavy emphasis on compliance, and they were really focused on criminal aliens, or foreign nationals, as we prefer to refer to them. And that was also where you saw the use of the executive order, which created DACA. And what's really fascinating is, as I was making my way to the bathroom earlier, and there's a sign here for this community college that says, DACA people welcome, which I thought was like really endearing. You know, I was like, wow, I'm proud of this place. I'm being here, and they welcome. But DACA was created under Obama because he couldn't get comprehensive reform through the legislation. And it's known as the DREAM Act. But it was created through an executive order, right? And executive orders are highly problematic because it's the administration's prerogative, regardless of who's in power, to create law instead of using the legislature to create law. Obama was like, I cannot work with this Congress. These people need protection. They need the ability to work and go to school. I agree with that, but I don't agree with the mechanism, because you're taking pressure away from the legislature to actually make something that's fixed and permanent. And if you have a dramatic change in political agenda through the new White House, those advantages can be taken away right away. And Trump's first message was, and what he campaigned on, is that I am going to take away DACA. I'm going to take away TPS, which is temporary protective status. I'm going to take away employment authorization for H-4 spouses, which is pretty nuanced, but if you look at that body of people who work based on DACA, people who are here through temporary protective status and H-4 employment authorization, that's 800,000 workers that this administration wants to remove through executive order. 800,000. Can you imagine if a corporation said we're going to lay off 800,000 people? What would that do to the economy? What does that do to predictability for businesses? And I think you'll hear from our local business leaders the insecurity and the uncertainty surrounding these programs makes it very difficult to make business decisions. And that's the perspective you need to have when you look at immigration. It is politicized, but it is not identified with one political party. It is manipulated and used to certain people's advantages. Trump says, if you give me the money for the wall, I'll make you a deal on DACA. They don't want to give him anything, but are they really protecting or not protecting the people that are affected? And these are the questions that are not really asked and are rarely answered. So when you hear about what's going on in the Valley, and I'm going to hand it over to Amy now, and she talks about the H-2B program, which in a lot of ways is the lifeblood of the businesses that operate in this region, keep in mind at how politically driven it is, but not how it's associated with a particular political party. So, Amy?
Hi. Thank you. Hi, my name is Amy Novak. I'm also an immigration attorney. My office is in West Vale, and I work with Jonathan. I'm the Mountain West Practice Director for Green and Spiegel, and I'm happy to be talking to you about H-2B visas and immigration and H-2B enforcement compliance. So like Jonathan, I want to start off with putting things in perspective. So while I do agree with Jonathan wholeheartedly that immigration is politicized but not political, The advent of President Trump into office has changed the situation slightly in terms of employment-based visas, specifically with his Buy American, High American memo in 2017. So his perspective is that there are American workers who do not have enough work, and the onus is then on the employer to hire American first. But if you see from this slide from the Department of Labor, you can see, which I actually find fascinating, unemployment is at its lowest level now since 2009. So as we all know living here, it's not that you can't find the workers, it's not that you can't find American workers, you can't find, we all know from living here that it's not possible to find American workers to do the jobs that you need to do. And that doesn't even take into consideration the fact that we operate in a seasonal economy, which makes hiring more difficult, but Jen and Gary can speak to that as well. And the fact that we're talking sometimes about lower wage jobs, which sometimes people find too demanding. I have clients who say that they'll hire for landscaping, let's say, for example, and some of their workforce will work for a day or 2 days and then decide that it's difficult. You're disagreeing? Okay. They'll decide that it's difficult and then they don't want to continue working. This is just a slide that shows the H-2B use by state, and here in Colorado, we are one of the higher H-2B users. My perspective is that that's because we have very many seasonal jobs. The entire state operates based on tourism, winter and summer, and so it's difficult to find workers to work year-round. Okay. Now moving on, coming back to the statistics. So the first thing that I wanted to tell you is that approval rates for employment-based requests to the Department of Homeland Security have declined from 16.8% in fiscal year 2016 to 22.6% in fiscal year 2018. So overall, the trend with the government is to deny employment-based requests. That is not our problem, though. Due to the low level of unemployment, workers not being able to find the workforce that they need, the demand for temporary work visas, known as the H-2B visa, has skyrocketed. And again, Gary and Jen can testify to this. But I have some facts that I thought would be interesting. The H-2B visa is a visa that was designed by Congress for temporary non-agricultural work. The requirements are that the need has to be of a temporary basis for 10 months or less, and that the employer must test the labor market to make sure that there are no U.S. workers. The visa has an annual cap of 66,000 workers per year, and that cap is divided out into 2 different release dates. The first release date is in October, and it typically covers the winter season, and the second release date is in April, and that typically covers the summer season. Since the economy has slowly started to recover, the H-2B cap has been met earlier and earlier each year, and this is what I thought was interesting. If you look at the first season of the H-2B cap, it was met in March of 2016, meaning employers who wanted to hire workers with a start date on or after April 1st could then hire workers up until March. So that's almost 5 months into the cap season. If you look in December, it was met, if you look in 2017, it was met in December, a good 4 months earlier. And then in 2018, it was met even a couple weeks earlier. For our purposes, we're not, at least here in the Valley, my experience, is that we're not as concerned with the winter cap because we typically are able to find enough workers in the winter and or to apply early enough to meet the cap deadline. But when you start talking about the second half, oops, that's, no, okay, I don't have that there. No. Okay, I do. So when you start talking about the second half, you're talking about landscapers or people who work in the summertime. In 2016, the cap was met in May, but Congress had passed a returning worker cap exemption. It was met in March of 2017, and then both in 2018 and 2019, the cap was met on February. In 2018 and 2019, there were enough applications for 86 and 95,000 workers. So if you're looking to hire an H-2B worker, you're already sort of, you're having a problem from the get-go, because this year you had a 1 1/3 chance to get your workers. And this year there was a whole fiasco with the computer system, and it just made life a lot more difficult. And so you're sitting here saying, yes, I know that, I can't find workers, what am I supposed to do now? So what I'd like to tell you, I have a 4-prong approach of things that I try to do. One is to be as proactive, and detail-oriented as possible, which is always a good strategy in business, but with an H-2B visa, it's more, turn what around? I'm just gonna, thanks, sorry. So with an H-2B, it's even more important. You can't miss one deadline. So every single piece of evidence that you want to submit with your application, your actual application, it has to be 100% completed prior to the time that you push send on the portal. I also make sure that myself and my staff, we're all aware of every change that happens. And there are quite a few changes that happen on the Department of Labor level. For example, this year, because there was such a fiasco in filing for visas, the Department of Labor has decided to take the filing from a first-come, first-served basis and put it into a random lottery. They're also changing the way you do advertising for workers, moving from a print-based advertising system to an online advertising system. So if you were not aware of that, you would be behind the 8 ball in terms of trying to get your workers. The next thing that I always encourage everyone to do is to advocate on behalf of H-2B visas. And I was having a conversation with Gary before. There are a lot of lobbying organizations to which we're both members that appear to focus solely on H-2Bs and that appear to be making a difference in terms of how Congress is viewing the H-2B visa. Again, it's a program governed by the Department of Labor and CIS, and the program is critical for small businesses or medium businesses who can't find the workers that they need, and the advocacy in Congress has made a difference to the extent that even though the cap was met this year in February, Secretary Nielsen of the formerly of the DHS has decided to release an additional 30,000 visas because we know the demand is high. And so I believe, even though Jonathan may disagree, that advocacy will make a difference in terms of the temporary non-skilled worker visa. The other approach is obviously to hire locally, and then the fourth approach would be to look at other types of visas, such as an H-2A agricultural worker visa or a J-1 summer work travel visa, or maybe even an H-1B or an L. And I have handouts of all the slides with all the statistics in case anyone wants to take them home. So now I want to move on to enforcement, because this is also a practical panel about enforcement. The Department of Labor announced in September 2018 a new education and enforcement initiative focused on two of the two biggest users of the H-2B visa for seasonal work, hotels and landscapers. Their plan is to conduct more extensive investigations of employers using the H-2B visa program to provide compliance through the investigations. Now, I don't know if anyone here has participated in a wage and hour division audit, but when the auditor comes to your office, they look through all of your paperwork to determine and make sure that you are in compliance with the regulations which are found on, which I don't have on a slide, but I have a handout, on Appendix B, Assurances and Obligations of H-2B Employers. And if for some reason they find a violation, fines start at Fines start at over $12,000 for one violation. So there could be one violation, such as failure to pay overtime for one worker for one day. The only thing that mitigates that is your good faith compliance with the program requirements. And by way of anecdotal evidence, I always encourage my clients to ensure that their files are audit worthy and that we go through them. And I had a client last year who was audited, and her paperwork was so spotless that she got away with one $250 fine. There was one violation, one $250 fine. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're in compliance with the regulations that are found in the Department of Labor website. That's it. Now I guess I'll turn it back over to Jonathan.
It's like you've used this thing before or something. All right, appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the H-2B program is challenging. It really is. And Amy hit on a couple of things I actually think are pretty interesting. She was talking about this thing called Buy American, Hire American. And one thing to really bear in mind is that under the Trump administration, there has been 0 new immigration laws that were passed through Congress. Like, 0. There's been a few regulations. There's been talk about regulations, but the majority of the changes have come through something called policy memoranda, which is a funky thing in terms of like being a lawyer because it's just policy, but it carries the weight of law. So to kind of put this in perspective, they come up with this thing called Buy America, Hire American. The acronym is BAHA. And as an immigration attorney, they're like definitely laughing at me every single day, right? But this rule says something that is like unfathomable because it has no basis in law whatsoever. And it says before any visa can be issued, before a consular officer renders a decision, they have to ask themselves, how does this impact the US workforce? That is nowhere in the regulations. Nowhere. But that's what's creating these tremendous denial rates that Amy pointed to. So you're seeing things like 4-fold increase in H-1B denials. But the real kicker is there used to be this rule, which makes a lot of sense from the perspective of a business, which would say, if a previous adjudicator approved a case, we are going to give deference to that decision. So if you come in and an adjudicator says, this is a good job, it's an H-1B job, the next adjudicator, when the person goes for an extension, has to say, this is a good person, this is a good job, good H-1B job. Trump changed it. No prior deference. Every case is reviewed de novo, which is a Latin legally term for anew, which is essentially saying, it's like we've never met you before. So there's tons of people who have been in the United States for years and years and years and years and years. Employers that are relying on these people who are now getting denied and having to leave the United States, which is crazy because, I don't know. For me personally, in my life, and especially knowing my wife, who is like super into routine, and for businesses, you want to have some sort of mechanism to make decisions for the future based off of what you think is going to happen. And if you don't know if you're going to be able to stay in the country or you don't know if you're going to be able to keep that employee, it makes it very challenging to make business decisions. This is from an administration that is supposed to be run by a businessman. This is from an administration who is married to a foreign national. This is from a businessman whose own business, his own golf course, had a whole bunch of undocumented workers who just had to leave. And my feeling on the H-2B program is, yes, advocacy works, but it also works because Trump-based businesses typically hire temporary seasonal workers. There might be something there, I'm just saying. But some other things that I thought were kind of interesting is, you know, this whole idea is supposed to be under this concept of protectionism that we talked about before, right? Protecting US workers. But what people don't realize, and this is the part that doesn't get reported a lot, is that US companies are now setting up operations in Canada, and it's a new phenomenon. You guys have all heard of like offshoring, right? Where you have like your call center in India or the Philippines or whatever. There's this concept of nearshoring where tech workers who can't get the H-1B visa or have been denied extensions are now being placed in Canada so they can operate in the same time zone as their clients. And Canada, wisely, has opened up the doors to immigration. If you've ever been to Toronto, more than half the population is foreign-born. Microsoft just opened a 5,000-person office in Toronto because they couldn't get the visas for those people to work in the United States. And we had our Christmas party last year, and my firm is actually headquartered in Toronto. We had one of our partners down. And I'm giving this very impassioned speech to the staff about how proud I am of them persevering in this challenging time. And my partner's in the back. He's going, 4 more years. 4 more years. Because they've never been busier. Our Canadian office has grown by 50% since Trump took office in 2.5 years. They've gone from 70 employees to 130 employees. So you tell me whose economy we're helping. Look, I get protectionism, and I understand it has a place. We should put US workers first. I mean, we have to protect our own. And Amy put up that really interesting slide that showed unemployment trends. If there was a policy like what we see today in 2008, you know, it makes sense. You have 12%, 13% unemployment. You got to protect US workers. 4%, less than 4%, the highest participation of the labor force in recent history. 600,000 open professional jobs that aren't going filled right now. Even Trump, if you heard him during his State of the Union address, said, we're going to increase legal immigration. I was like, am I listening to the right guy here? Behind the scenes, supposedly, Jared Kushner is working on a deal to increase legal immigration. At the same time, you have the president tweeting that we have enough people here and we're closing the border. Well, that's a fascinating time we're living in. Sorry, some other notes from Amy's thing. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about deterrence, but I don't really want to get... If you guys want like the detailed version of this, we can make this slideshow available to the audience. Yes? Okay, great. Okay, so there's this whole thing about them coming to you and checking things out and what's going on. It's called a notice of inspection. And what they're doing is they're coming to see if you've been filling out that Reagan-era I-9 form correctly, okay? Now, traditionally speaking, they're looking for criminal prosecution, human trafficking, smuggling, harboring of illegal aliens. But really, it's about compliance and the fines that are created. So they issue this notice of inspection, and then you have 3 days to turn over all of your documents. And for paperwork violations, they can range from $216 to over $2,000. For knowingly hiring undocumented workers, it can go all the way up to 21 grand per violation. And egregious violations, you can lose like debarment from certain programs and other things like that. And they look at a bunch of different factors, the size of the business, good faith efforts, similar to what Amy was talking about. Oh, and I did this little trail map for you guys because I'm like, we're in Colorado, you know, but this is kind of how it happens. This is actually taken from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement website. But they issue the notice of inspection, they come into the form, and if you have a violation, it comes down to whether or not it's substantial or technical. If it's technical violation, they give you a chance to fix it. And if it's substantial, they'll give you a warning notice or a notice of intent to fine. And then you can either settle or go to a hearing before an administrative law judge. Under Obama, when they were doing these things, it always ended up here. Like 9 times out of 10, warning notice. With this administration, it's always here. Notice of intent to fine. And the violations can be crazy. All right, so in Philly, this is where I'm from, certain industries are targeted for certain reasons. But just to kind of like put this into a context that is like a little bit more tangible. Small construction outfit, South Philadelphia, think of Rocky, think of them building row homes, all that jazz. 15 employees, all of them legal, okay? No illegal immigrants at all. ICE comes and there's a notice of inspection, they comply within 3 days. All of their forms were wrong. Paperwork violations, not filling things out correctly, wrong documents, etc. They were fined $45,000. 15-person shop, 45 grand. Legal workers. Are we protecting U.S. jobs? That's a question I'm asking myself, There's a golf course that we represented. Very well-meaning golf course. They had everybody fill out the paperwork, but they're not forensic document experts, okay? They get one of these notice of inspection. I happen to know the investigator, because that's kind of like what Philly's like. I think it's like this, like everybody knows each other, right? Philly's like a big little town. So I call him up and I'm like, I need an extension. He's like, cool, don't worry about it. We go in there, we look at everything. Half the workforce is illegal, like half. Like showing these bad. If you have somebody who presents a passport or a green card and it's in Comic Sans font, pretty good indication that it's a fake. Well, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But this is the middle of the summer. And these guys are left with a very real decision. Do we let all of these people go and ruin our entire business? Or do we keep them on and face the fines? So I haven't gotten the results from their fines yet, but they decided to keep them all on. I mean, my best guess is they're going to get jacked for about $250,000 on fines. Right? It's crazy. So if you are curious about substantive and technical violations, this is really what it comes down to. Like the form itself is kind of funny because it's super simple to fill out, but everybody makes mistakes on it. It's just one of these things. Like I can tell you one of them is you have to complete it within 3 days of hire. Okay, I run an immigration shop. I advise clients on this all the time. I got like 6 of these things going on at my shop. 3 days of hire. You have to have them come in. They have to fill the paperwork out and they have to complete. There is no turning back. If it is the 4th day, you're subject to fine. Okay. Now you can mitigate these things, and I think if ICE is watching, don't come. Okay, but there are ways to mitigate it. There's also this concept of actual knowledge and constructive knowledge, which really plays into it. Like the thing that the system is not good at is identity theft, which is a huge problem. Like we all know about all these companies that have had all their records hacked and people's identities have been stolen. Recently, I had somebody try to buy a Hyundai on my credit card. I mean, these things are happening all over the place, right? But a lot of times, that's how they'll get through the I-9 process is by using fake identities, right? A lot of times these people will then get buddy-buddy with a manager who's not related in HR. And they'll go to the manager and be like, hey, can you help me out with my immigration status? Like, I need you to sponsor me. Or can you support me as I'm going through this process? And that's actually what turns it from like actual knowledge or constructive knowledge to actual knowledge. One of the most famous cases of constructive knowledge was actually done through a contractor situation. It was in 2005. It was with Walmart. And there was no finding because it went to settlement. But essentially what it was is they put out a bid for their evening, like overnight cleaning crews. And the bid that won, if you worked it out per worker, was going to be less than minimum wage. So that should have been constructive knowledge to the contractor that the people didn't have status. So there's like some slick lawyering things you can do to get out from that if you do have a lot of contractors. You can have an indemnification clause written into your agreement where the contractor assumes liability for the legality of the workforce. But that's kind of what they're talking about with constructive and willful knowledge. Tips for dealing with immigration and customs enforcement: know your jurisdiction. Each ICE office has different standards. Work to produce all the records in 3 days, but honestly, like, they are so backed up right now. I ask for extensions all the time and have no issue getting them. I'm like a kumbaya kind of lawyer, right? So I want to work with you, not against you. I find that works better in my jurisdiction. But I know Amy's experience with some of the investigators that you've had out here, they're far more aggressive than I'm used to experiencing. So you have to kind of really understand who you're dealing with. You can negotiate the fines, which is important. And the other thing is they make errors too. So always check their work, right? And here's some tips you can do for keeping your house in order. Internal policies, having outside audit procedures, engaging an immigration law firm to help you create policies. I know a good one if you're looking. And also, if you're using these I-9 vendors, they can actually create electronic records for you, which are a great tool for larger corporations. But also that idea with indemnification can stem through to the vendors that you use to help you compile your documents. Now, on the flip side of this, there's like a little known division that's gaining a lot of teeth, which is the Immigrants' Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And they're there to ensure that immigrants aren't discriminated against in the hiring practice. So, like, you're not allowed to query too much into somebody's status at the time of hire. There's only certain questions you can ask. And when they go and fill out this Form I-9, a lot of times they'll come to you and say, hey, what can I give you, right? You're not allowed to suggest documents. That in and of itself is a violation. And you also have to be like a little bit mindful of geography, because right now I'm defending a company that's being investigated by these guys, and it was because a recruiter asked somebody from Puerto Rico what their citizenship was. So you're from Puerto Rico, what's your citizenship? You're from Puerto Rico. So that was deemed to be discriminatory in the hiring practice. Like, I'm telling you, the legal bill that they've racked up because of that one question is astronomical. Now, they're not the little construction site. They can afford it, so it's cool. But it's a big problem. So here's the magic question that you're allowed to ask if you're curious is, are you authorized to work for our company in the United States without sponsorship? That's been vetted by the ABA. If they say yes, you are not allowed to ask any more questions about their status, where they're from, who they are. That's all discriminatory. But if they say no, you can ask for any documentation you want to determine what level of sponsorship you will have to engage in. Okay? Now there's the raid component. Raids really went away after Bush. And there's been a small handful of them under the Trump administration, but they are going to be coming back, I think, in full force. And last week, there's CVE Technology Group, which is based right outside of Dallas. I think it's right outside of Dallas, but everything in Texas is like, so it could be miles and miles away. But what happened to them is they had an I-9 investigation, okay? And they noticed a tremendous amount of irregularities. And they had a number of tips from people in the area, competitors, saying that these people were having an advantage because they were hiring undocumented workers. And last week, they went there. They took everybody out of the building. They asked them for their documentation. They gave people that had legal status green armbands, and people that didn't have status, yellow armbands. All right? And anybody who had a yellow armband was arrested. 280 people were arrested. About half of them have been released from custody as of this afternoon when I was like looking into it. The company is probably going to have criminal prosecutions against the HR managers and the directors of the organization for knowingly hiring undocumented workers, because you can get done under two provisions. One is harboring, and one is transporting. Okay, so if you're harboring an illegal alien, and I only use the term alien if it's referring to the actual statute, because I think it's kind of not good term. But if you're transporting them, you can be done for transporting an undocumented worker or illegal alien, or harboring an illegal alien. And then they'll probably get done for violations of the visa system itself. They have a PR nightmare on their hands. So these raids are coming back. Now, there's something that disappeared a while ago, which is also reappearing now, called the Social Security no-match letter. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this, but it's essentially like they look at your payroll records and they look at the Social Security number and then they look at the identity of the person. If it doesn't match, they send you a letter and say, hey, this person has to fix it. It's not indicative if they don't have status. Because like if you take your spouse's last name, you might show up on like a no-match letter, right? But they've disappeared for a while. And now the question is like, is a Social Security no-match letter under this administration going to be shared with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is going to trigger the worksite investigation, which ultimately might lead to the raid posture? So it's like these small little indicators that you're seeing from different government agencies that are sort of the harbinger of future problems that you might face. In the same respect that you might have somebody come and do an H-2B investigation through the Department of Labor, will they then refer it over to ICE? And like what Amy, kind of alluded to is for a lot of these businesses that are trying to get H-2B visas, if they don't secure one of the numbers because of the shortage, sometimes they turn to people without status. So you have these quasi-legal, illegal workforces. So it's like you're violating these laws because you're not doing the H-2B visa program right, and you're going to get jacked because you have all these people that don't have status working for you. So it's creating like a really big problem there as well. So look, there's some common sense stuff, but I can tell you if you run a company, the best person to educate about this stuff is not the guy that runs the company. It's not the head of HR, although important. It's the person that sits at the front desk, right? Because that person needs to know to call somebody when they come a-knocking. They will come with a warrant. It will be very specific. You do not have to give them more than what the warrant says. A lot of times they're looking for a single individual, a criminal alien who has a long record or has been coming into the country. Limit the exposure by educating that person who's going to be the greeter. I mean, that is actually like the single best tip you can do for a corporate perspective, is to say, okay, I see you're from ICE, hold on a second, call HR, call the manager, call the attorney, and say, you just have to wait right here, sir. Right? Would you like some coffee? But I mean, that's really what's going on with these raids, and it's pretty incredible. So, in conclusion, the issues of immigration are something that is really facing the nation. We're struggling with somewhat like, what is our identity? There's all these people that are very motivated by it. When there's the humanitarian crisis at the border, they flock to the streets. When you have people being turned away because of a travel ban, they go to the airports. But as we were kind of talking about earlier, nobody is going to flock to the streets and say, we need more H-2B visa numbers. It doesn't motivate the people to speak. And yes, you do have advocacy through good lawyers that go to DC every year to speak to the Congress people. But what we need to realize is that as humanitarian as is important, regardless of your opinion, the problem it is with people who aren't here with status. We also have to recognize that our economy, especially in an area like this valley, is heavily dependent on workers from other countries. And the fact that we need mechanisms to do it legally. Because I will think for the most part, employers want to do it legally. They want to use the system correctly. And that's the side of immigration that's not being spoken about. Are our laws actually protecting U.S. workers in the name of protectionism? Or are we losing opportunity for economic growth because we're not willing to access this aspect of the labor force? And that's what I hope you guys will take away from this presentation. And I thank you very much.
Jonathan and Amy, thank you. Gary and Jen, if you want to grab a seat as well. I've got a couple questions, and I know Chris will be running through the audience as well. So questions for you guys. If you do, just please throw a hand up, and we'll get questions from you guys as well. Gary Woodworth, CEO of Gallegos Corp., Jen Law, Director of Human Resources for Vail Mountain. Amy and Jonathan, please feel free to share your feedback on some of these questions as well. Gary, we'll start with you and with Jen, and really just, if you would, share why this issue, why immigration is important to your business.
Thank you, Chris. I've been with Gallegos since 1987. In the mid-90s, we began using the H-2B program, as Jonathan alluded to, as a legal means to increase our workforce to meet that peak seasonal need that we would have every summer and fall in doing construction in the mountains. From that point in time that we started up through 2008 and the recession, the program was very effective, largely due to the returning worker exemption that allowed that increased demand to allow that cap to increase and meet that need that became exponential during those growth years. In the recession, the need obviously changed. The cap was not, there's not pressure on the cap. Those who wanted to use the program and met the requirements and the labor certifications were able to get their visas. As we exited the recession, things got busier nationwide. That cap became strained again. Without the returning worker exemption, many companies weren't able to get their employees. And that's when we began more advocacy in trying to be part of a solution to it, as opposed to just a victim of not getting our cap. And so, Chris, it's important to us to be able to increase our numbers with that legal workforce that is vetted when they come here. By the time they come to our place to work, they've been through all of the consular appointments. They've been verified. They don't have any criminal backgrounds, or they would not be here. They're here for one reason, and that's to work, send money home, and go home at the end of the year. They're checked in when they come in the country. They're checked in when they go out. It is in my opinion, the only effective immigration program that there is in making sure these people enter and exit correctly. Immigration reform beyond that is a large issue that I think we all would like to see corrected, updated at some form, so that we can employ more of the local people that we know are in and amongst us, that we help to raise as kids and support and educate, and give them an opportunity in our country. But that's a larger issue.
And Jen, your thoughts on that? Why is this important to your business?
So Amy talked a lot about the H-2B visa, which Vail Resorts we do utilize some. We also utilize very heavily and more so the J-1 visa. And that program is designed more for students who are coming to look for a particular experience. And we have found that program very beneficial because a lot of those students are coming from areas where our guests are also coming from. And so it's an amazing experience for our guests to be able to come and find some of ski instructors or people who are serving their food or selling them their tickets also speak the same language and understand their culture. And so from our perspective, it's really helpful to have that diversity for our guests and for that experience. We also have found that for our employees, they really enjoy being able to meet people from other cultures. I think it helps people to better understand the world and better understand where others are coming from and that they're not actually so different from us.
And Jen, we'll stick with you. And Jonathan and Amy, feel free to jump in on this one as well, since you represent a lot of clients across the country and here locally. But Jen first, and then Gary, and then we'll see if Amy and Jonathan want to jump in. But I'll just be blunt. Isn't this just a way to get low-cost employees? Right? Isn't it like why the Hire American First stuff that Jonathan talked about? Isn't it just a way to hire at a lower cost and have a lower expense line item for your business?
So that is a myth, and I think that Jonathan and Amy can maybe talk to it, but the rates that this is all very heavily vetted. The programs are very heavily vetted, and we spend a lot of time and money with attorneys to make sure that we can dot our I's and cross our T's, just like Amy and Jonathan talked about, because it's an arduous process. And so it's not easy from that standpoint, and also the Department of Labor actually sets the rates in which we have to pay the workers. So we know what the cost is going into it, and that doesn't necessarily save us any money either. And I would say that we also house the majority of those workers. And through the J1 program in particular, part of that program is that we give them educational opportunities. So, which we would offer to all of our employees, but that is a specific part of the program that we also offer them education around what it's like to work in hospitality and how to provide guest service and a variety of different leadership aspects as well.
I concur fully that those rates are set and established. They vary year over year based on what's going on nationwide. To put some specifics to it, in our industry, in this area, the minimum that we're allowed to pay that group of individuals is $17, almost near $18 an hour. That's what we have to pay as a minimum. Our average is closer to $20 an hour that we pay that group. We have never fallen at or near that minimum level, just based on the experience that they bring and the way that we want to treat them. Additionally, as an employer, we have program costs that add to that of about $2.50 per hour per employee. That does not include the benefits package that we offer to them as well. We give them full health insurance options, just like any other employee, paid time off, and really go out of our way to treat them just like any other worker that would be coming in. So is it a cheap end around to hiring local? No. And I could talk about it for...
Jonathan, Amy?
So to piggyback on what Gary just said, any company that hires a foreign worker also has to ensure the similar treatment of a U.S. worker. Should a U.S. worker not be similarly treated, and should the company be audited, they will be subject to huge fines, along the lines of what Jonathan was talking about. So again, I would agree with Gary. It's not an end run around to anything.
What I will say, in fairness to that statement, is that bad actors are going to be bad actors. Like, the H-2B visa program is actually pretty insulated, and it's very hard to manipulate it. In other visa classifications, it's easier. Like with the H-1B, which is your standard working visa, there's these wage levels. So where you see the game playing is like somebody will be saying this is a level 1 occupation, but the actual recruitment they did was for like a level 3 occupation. So that they're lowering down the minimums that they have to pay based on the level associated with it. There's stuff like visas for students after they graduate that don't have minimum salary requirements. There's other visa classifications that don't have salary requirements because the Department of Labor is not involved. Like an L visa, which is for intercompany transferees, you can actually keep them on the foreign payroll. So there's a lot of like Indian companies that do tech outsourcing. There's a few of them that are very well known, and if it wasn't being recorded, I might say what they are. But they'll transfer their workers over and keep them on the Indian pay schedule and then charge like U.S. premiums. So, and that's actually something that the Trump administration is, call it like it is. They're doing a really good job on trying to change that aspect of the visa system. My thing is, you got to make it easier for everybody. And I know that sounds counterintuitive as somebody who makes a living off of it being complicated, but if you made it easier for everybody and you made the visas more accessible, then I think the enforcement efforts would be more justified. Like if you gave people the mechanism and the way to do it so they could do it right, and then they don't comply, throw the book at them. You know what I mean? But I think that if you do the system correctly, regardless of the visa classification, it is impossible to favor foreign nationals over U.S. workers. But like anything, there's ways to abuse the system. And we got great employers here. I like to think that I represent great employers, but there's going to be abuse. So the question is how do you separate the abuse out from the people that are using the program correctly? And what we're talking about with the enforcement efforts is they're not applied in that mechanism to weed that out.
Good. So you shared some of the data with unemployment levels and things like that. In Eagle County, our unemployment levels are actually even lower than the national numbers. It was around 4% there. We're around 2%. We have over 1,600 open jobs in Eagle County as we speak. So that, what I'm curious with, and Gary and Jen, if you would provide your feedback to this, but what impact does that low unemployment level and the inability to bring employees into businesses have on our business growth and on our economic development as a community. And I'll share one or two other thoughts as you think about that. The partnership, every year we do a workforce study. We found we had about 75% of businesses in Eagle County who planned to grow, who wanted to grow in the next 3 to 5 years. And over 60% of businesses who had open positions. So that gives some framework to that question of what impact does it have on business growth if you have 3 out of 4 businesses wanting to grow, 2 out of 3 businesses who have open jobs and can't fill the jobs they have? What impact does that have on our community development and our economic development, on your business growth?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I've got a little bit of some kind of statistics and some information to share. So one thing that I think is interesting is that only 90% of our workforce for Vail Resorts in all of our resort communities are either American or have some kind of permanent work authorization. So it's not a huge part of our population in actuality. However, what I would say is that without those extra workers that we get due for the visa programs, we may not be able to have enough work for domestic workers without those people. And what I mean by that is that if we don't have that supplemental workforce, we might not even be able to open a restaurant. We might not be able to be opening places on our mountain because we just don't have enough workers to even staff it. So I think that is in itself kind of tells you, like, if we don't have that supplemental workforce and therefore it's impacting the domestic workforce, that's impacting our ability to grow and provide for our guests. The other, I guess, piece of information that I think is really interesting is that Rob Katz, who's our CEO, who most of you probably know who he is, he wrote a really interesting op-ed recently, and I'm just going to provide kind of a quote from there because I think it's really interesting. So this is actually from the Center for American Progress, estimates that with a path to citizenship, like the DREAM Act potentially, we have the ability to add potentially up to $300 billion to the American economy by 2030 and create more than 1.4 million jobs. So I think that that's really telling that we need this workforce to help build the rest of our workforce.
In construction, it's absolutely a limiting factor to the ability to grow a business and or sustain a business. We're seeing fewer and fewer young people wanting to enter the skilled trades market. We try all sorts of avenues, whether it be career-wise through the partnership and internal apprenticeship program that we have, extensive recruiting at the job fairs, employee referrals, every avenue that we can possibly find, yet we still have an inability to attract young workers. We have many of our employees that are beginning to retire and get to that point. Our company will be at 49 years. Many of those people have been with us 30 years, and we're seeing that shift. And so without the availability of a workforce to replace that, it truly put a limiting factor on our ability to plan growth in a particular market, if the work is present, of course. We've been able to succeed the last few years by shifting people, whether it be from our Denver market up to the mountains as needed. Although with the strong economy in every region or every market, people are less inclined to leave home, be away from their kids during the week. It's not as appealing. They can go work for somebody else and not have to travel. So the loyalty of our current employees have gotten us through some of that. But for construction, it truly will be and is a limiting factor in any sort of growth and or achieving schedules within construction, which are driving delays that are causing problems on many projects of size between $2 and $5 or $6 million in completion costs by the time these projects are complete.
Amy, Jonathan, anything to add with that, with your experience with your clients of business growth and the impact that immigration and H-2B visas and other visa programs might have?
I think it's somewhat like industry specific, at least in my neck of the woods, just because like there is such a population growth here in general that's like driving construction. And I mean, what's the population growth in the region annually?
Eagle County right now is about 55,000 people. Our valley here is around 45,000,
And-
but it's grown pretty tremendously, 1990 to 2000 specifically.
Yeah.
But we've seen steady growth since then as well.
Yeah, right. Like, so like Philly, it's like we were really happy that we're adding people. You know, it's like it's a big thing. Like we went up 2-point-something% in the 2000s, right? That was a big deal. So it's really more like industry specific. But there's certain industries. I mean, here's something that's interesting. Every time you file an H-1B visa, you have to pay a training fee. Depending on the size of the employer, it's $1,500 if you have more than 25 full-time employees, and it's $750 if you have less than 25 full-time employees. For the longest time, I had no idea where that money went. I was like doing some research the other day, and it actually sets up a scholarship that goes to U.S. people to train them in STEM. And it's something like, since that fee went into effect back in 2000, I'm not 100% sure on the numbers, but it's over $1 billion that have been given out in scholarship money. And that's actually where we see like the greatest need for immigrants on the professional side of things, is in these STEM fields, because Americans like don't want to go into it. I think as a society, we recognize the importance of STEM. Like we're going around looking at elementary schools for my daughter, and they have like STEAM labs and STEM labs, and there's all sorts of like toys on the market to get younger kids and women in particular interested in these fields. But in terms of like the people that I work with, the companies I work with, it's this lack of science, technology, engineering, and math that's retarding growth of certain industries. Like here, the population and the situation's a little bit different, but that's where I see it the most.
Since I live here, I see the difficulty here. I have many clients who try to employ H-2B workers in Eagle County, but I also have many clients throughout the country. And the one common theme among all the clients is that without a stable, predictable workforce, they can't plan their business needs. They have to turn away contracts, they can't grow as much, they cannot run a successful, profitable business. And what my clients say to me is, we're American business owners. What about us? And what about our needs as an American business owner? Which is not to take away from the need to protect U.S. workers, and I think this point has been made, but I'm going to reiterate it, that with the low unemployment rate, there has to be a way to provide for U.S. worker protection and U.S. business growth.
Yeah, and that's and remember, if you guys have questions, I've got a couple more, but we'll take questions from the audience as well. So think about that. That's a good segue to this next question, Amy, from the standpoint of like how quaint that people assume the federal government cares about their business or them. I'm being a little bit glib, but like so the question really for all of you is, how do local businesses engage on a national level? Because my perception is the national process and the national system doesn't care, right? It's just, the system isn't built to care. It's built to be political. There was a lot of what both parties and both the history that Jonathan shared. So how do we engage on national issues like this in a meaningful way?
I'm going to start.
Please.
You might have a perception that the national government doesn't care, and on some level, as an institution, it might not. But I can guarantee you that every representative on the state level or on the local level, state level, or national level cares about their jobs. So the best way to advocate is to get to know your representatives and encourage them to pass initiatives that you think are important. Be vocal. It works.
I agree, and as I mentioned earlier, we've become active in that. And Chris, I guess I was in a meeting in January in D.C. with the Secretary of Labor, Acosta, and he made the statement, there is more work available now than there are workers to do it. So the head of the Department of Labor is fully aware of this challenge that we all have, yet it seems to be, whether it's partisan, nonpartisan disagreement, they can't come to terms on how they should, could, or might fix it. And so, yes, I agree. I've become familiar on a first-name basis with all the senior staffers within our representatives' offices, met with many of them personally. Amy is correct. As far as Colorado goes, we have full support representation for immigration reform and or H-2B or other seasonal work programs. We've heard that from all of them. It was touched on earlier in a slightly different context. Colorado is the third highest using state in the nation for H-2B. By per capita, we are the largest user of the H-2B program. And so it's been a large driver of our economies, back to your prior question as well, Chris, in the years that have passed, and this increased demand on the program has strained that. But reaching out to our representatives and really getting them to engage and push on the committee levels that they're involved with has made a difference, as Amy alluded to earlier.
I would agree, and Vail Resorts, we're fortunate enough to be a really large corporation that has an actual department and people who focus on government relations, and they go out and build relationships with people in all different areas, in all the areas that we operate, to literally, continue to advocate for what we need and why we need it and why it's important. And I would say because we're such a large corporation, we're not only advocating for ourselves, but we're advocating for the communities that we live in, because it's so crucial. I think we make some progress here and there. I think it's really challenging, but we've got to keep it up. I would say the other avenues that we've tried to use is we operate in the national park system with Grand Teton Lodge Company, so we've tried to use that avenue. We also obviously operate mostly on U.S. Forest Service lands. We also try to just use every avenue that we can to try to share that information and share that knowledge, to try to get advocation where we can.
I think it's kind of funny because, like, with immigration, and I mentioned it before, there was like 2 recent attempts to have comprehensive immigration reform, and they failed because they were, and I'm sort of a little bit different than most immigration attorneys in this respect, because they tried to do an omnibus bill where they solve all aspects of immigration. They do enforcement, they deal with the people without status, they deal with H-2B stuff, and they try to wrap it all up into one bill, and they think that that's going to get enough people vested and interested in it that it will get pushed through. Because it's failed twice, I don't think it works. And like, we really need to kind of take a step back and do disparate legislation for specific issues. So there's kind of this saying, right? Like, don't let best get in the way of better. You know, we have these rules that have been around since 1986. Like, it's crazy, but there's no contemplation of like even remote work as a concept in immigration, you know, because it didn't exist the last time we had these laws. So I think that's part of the issue, is the last few attempts have been trying to get so all-encompassing that it hasn't allowed us to move the needle at all. And I think that that's what's really plaguing immigration. And it's kind of funny because I've taken note on this, but anytime something is proposed by a gang of however many senators, it's not going to work. Like, if it's the gang of 8 or 12 or 15, whatever, just ignore it. I made the mistake of reading the 2013 bill through because I thought it was going to go through. It was like 700 pages. I won't do that again if it's sponsored by a gang of whoever.
A gang of 51 might be our better tactic there, right? A gang of 51. Jen, you have something to add?
I just want to make one more comment about that. I mean, to show you like how far behind our government is, like the form, this I-9 form that we're talking about that you have to fill out, for every employee, like that's the focus, is like on the form and filling out this paper, and that's where the fines come from, and it's so antiquated. And it does not accommodate a seasonal workforce very well at all. Because we've made these crazy workarounds in our corporation in order to accommodate people to not have to do that form.
So I'm hearing, we're going to take questions in just one sec. I'm hearing get engaged, get involved. The people care, even if the system is a little bit dysfunctional. Trade associations, Chamber of Commerce groups, groups like the Forward US Coalition, things like that can speak on with a larger voice and back it up with your individual elected officials. I think that's good. The last question I have, and then we'll do questions from the audience. And taking it a little bit locally with the raids that you talked about and with the changing temperature, if you will, how do we alleviate the fear in our local immigrant community. I know that fear is very real. It exists in our schools, in our workforce, in our communities, within the community that is legal. There's fear that exists. Is there something we can do as a business community, as a community at large, to help alleviate the fear in our immigrant community?
Okay, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer. We do have someone here who works as an assistant to the police chief, who works specifically on an immigrant right committee, who might be able to answer it if she so desires. But while she's thinking about that, I will say that there's been a ton of advocacy in Eagle County from many groups for that exact purpose. And most of law enforcement is on board.
Our law enforcement, and Chris, if you would, we'll gather feedback. Our law enforcement community, for those who aren't aware of that effort, catch someone afterwards. It's really impressive what the sheriff's office and the police chiefs in Vail and Avon and others are doing to address that issue.
So I work for the Vail Police Department. Chief Henninger is a co-chair of the Law Enforcement Immigrant Alliance, which is LEA, and it is comprised of law enforcement agencies all through the county in cooperation with charity organizations like Catholic Charities and other outreach groups. And our efforts are to make the immigrant community feel safe and feel confident that they can reach out to law enforcement, that they can call 911 without fear of being asked what their status is, that they can report crime, they can help the police, and they don't have to worry about their questions about their status. We do other outreach efforts, coat drives, and we sponsor a Mexican mobile consulate event, and lots of things to reach out to the immigrant community and try to make them feel at ease.
Any feedback on that from you guys?
As was alluded to earlier, I think it really is a catch-22. If we are made aware that somebody is here illegally, our options get severely limited. It is a real issue in our community, and we all have had those experiences. Really, other than connecting them with many of the advocacy groups that are available and or connecting them with some legal advice to really understand their options and figure out how to navigate a system that in many regards could be built to operate against them. As an employer, there's not a lot we're able to do for them as an individual.
I love what you were just saying about what you guys do here, because it actually reminds me of like Philly's a sanctuary city, and it's specifically made so that like victims of crime feel comfortable stepping forward. It also attracts the ire of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which you might not see on such a high level here, but we feel like we have more ICE activity in Philly because of the way the community outreach is. But the best thing you can do is, if you feel motivated, vote. Because honestly, even though there was same rules, I told you, the laws haven't changed. Under the Obama administration, they had this concept of prosecutorial discretion, which essentially said is, if you're here, you're not breaking the law other than being here without status, you have no record, you haven't entered illegally multiple times, we're going to decide under our discretion not to prosecute you. Okay. The current idea is that anybody who's encountered who doesn't have status gets pulled in and processed and given what's known as a notice to appear. You have to go in front of an immigration judge. So again, the political view on how to treat people is, even absent comprehensive immigration reform or a legal mechanism for status, they have the ability to decide how to enforce these protocols. And that is like a big fundamental change. So I told you, Obama had the highest level of removal of people from the United States in the history of the United States up until that point. But he was very targeted in who he was going after. This is more like, I don't know, imagine fishing with a hook and one bait, and now you're just going with this big net. You know, that's like what we're experiencing now. So a change in political view and the way they decide to prosecute is the best way to create fear. Now, what can you do today? There's like lots of great organizations out there. You mentioned some of these nonprofits. They have your Know Your Rights worksheets. They can tell you what you can do. But ultimately, if the federal government wants to pick up an individual, they can. And that's to Amy's point. Like, there is no great answer.
And Kat, you had a question?
Can I see a show of how many people do have questions? All right, so we've got a lot of questions. We're about 3 minutes from time, so I want to give the
We'll get to
people
them.
who have made dinner reservations that need to leave. Let's get everybody who needs to leave, and then we'll probably continue past our time, but I don't want you to be uncomfortable because you have a dinner reservation. Anybody? Nobody's going to judge you, so great. Nobody's leaving? Great, here we go.
How might we use technology to make the process of hiring with these visas more efficient? Is it possible to do advance registration for asylum for immigrants who are coming from another country? Just thinking about ways that we can get beyond paper.
I love that question because I think about it all the time. One of the things that I think is that we have like amazing access to data. We know where the shortage occupations are. Like, we have programs that can mine data and tell you everything you need to know. You're telling me that the Department of Labor locally or the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't realize that there's a need for temporary seasonal work in the Vail region. Like, I'd be blown away. Or that we have a shortage of nurses, or that we have a shortage of physical therapists. These are things that are actually already on the books. In my opinion, we don't need temporary labor certification. Like, the H-2B program actually probably does not need to exist, sorry, Amy, in its current form, because we should be able to say, you know what, there's a need for 10,000 workers for this season in this region. Fill the 10,000. And if you still need more, then there's an application process. But we're not utilizing our ability to mine statistical data to impact our immigration system. And I think that that's where the benefit would be. To your specific question about asylum, that's a much thornier issue. We do have refugee programs where people do apply in advance from outside the United States. The asylum program, like what you're seeing on the southern border and declaring fear of persecution, it's so subjective that it would be almost impossible to place an objective mechanism on it. But when you're talking about labor statistics and modernizing things, we have a lot of tools that are available to us that we're not using.
And one thing you can do also, if you're concerned about the workers who are coming into the country, you can always do a background check on them to know if they've overstayed or if there's any criminal record or anything. So you can use technology in that way, I suppose. And just one point, there was talk in Washington about changing the H-2B program to certify based on the unemployment rate. It hasn't, it was just talk, it hasn't happened, but there is something that it is circulating at this moment in time for that exact reason that you were talking about.
Hi, my name is Kent, and I'm an associate broker with Berkshire Hathaway. And just a background point, in my real estate career, I've been in Scottsdale, Arizona, Park City, Utah, Lake Tahoe, Destin, Florida, Bend, Oregon, and here. And the set of issues we have here around, dependency on the Hispanic workforce, it's been part of my makeup for the last 25 years. But I want to actually make a suggestion to the two of you, and that is this notion of people that are underemployed. And I'll bet if we went down to Denver and we rounded up young adults from 18 to 25 who decided not to go to college, who've got a little bit of junior college, they're certainly underemployed. They can't compete, in Denver or Seattle for high-tech jobs. And I think that this doesn't help get you a higher quota, but I'll bet if there was a systematic approach, Gary, especially for you, to find these people, find veterans who are underemployed, and say, gee, we have a path that would work for you. We have a path that would work for you, not only this summer at 20 an hour, but how about Vail Resorts in the winter at 12 or 15?
There are programs in place currently in the Denver market being run by the Associated General Contractors of Colorado that are doing just that. It is an exposure 6-week program at Emily Griffith that seeks out just that type of individual that you described. They run them through and just get basic tool awareness, safety awareness, understanding of the environment they may be engaged in. They're taught interviewing skills, resume building, all of those things that need to go with finding a job. They bring in industry partners. We have hired a few of those people. We've had success with 2 of them. Retention with that group is still a challenge. And it actually at a state level, the I-25 project that's being done right through the center of Denver, I-70, where they're burying that portion, there's a mandate and a quota to hire a certain number of those people that you just described. And so it is something that's very actively being engaged at a local level with CareerWise in local school districts to try to identify, find some of those kids who realize they won't go to college and find that career path or build those life skills to have the work skills to be able to be successful. And so yes, it's an all of the above approach that I think every employer who is trying to fill this need is
Yeah, very similar to Gary, and both Gallegos and Vail Resorts participate in a program called CareerWise, which is through the Vail Valley Partnership, and we were one of the inaugural business members who participated, and basically we are identifying career pathways for students who may not, they could want to go to college, but maybe not the traditional paths, where they get to stay in school. CMC helps to pay for their schooling, and then we provide the opportunity in the career. So I think it's an awesome suggestion, and there's more that we could continue to look at in that realm, and we're starting to kind of dabble in that and figure out how to do it better because it's a great idea. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Beth Riley, and I work in early childhood. And my mission in my work is to make sure that children are healthy and ready to learn. And one of the barriers that I've been having, which has increased pretty significantly over the last 2-3 years, is that eligible children of immigrants are not applying for important programs like WIC or Medicaid. And even this year, we've had some families who are not applying for Head Start. And some of those families are being legally counseled to not apply. So my question to you, is that a myth that they are at risk in applying for these programs? And then how does legal counsel work with the risks versus benefits of, we had one child who needs an eye operation and wasn't going to apply for Medicaid because they were worried about losing their ability to stay in the United States.
So a lot of that stems from a policy memorandum that was leaked, but hasn't actually become effectuated, that said, if you take public assistance, that's grounds for not being given an immigration benefit. So that's what's driving the fear in engaging in those programs. Now, what you have to look at is whether or not the program is an insurance or if it's truly public assistance, and that's sort of the dividing line. So if you're somebody on a visa and you happen to be laid off, you can collect unemployment because it's an insurance. But some of these other public benefits might not be considered, if you get food stamps or something in that program, it can be viewed as problematic later, and that's what's driving a lot of the concern and fear. So again, it's not a law. It's not actually even a policy. It's a leaked policy that is changing behavior. And I agree with you that it is terribly unfortunate, but it's a federal policy. I don't know if you have anything to add locally.
No, I do. Unfortunately, the problem that you're probably seeing is that in the policy that was leaked, the usage of things like Medicaid by children was going to be imputed to their parents. So while it's perfectly lawful for, let's say, either a non-immigrant or U.S. citizen to use one type of benefit program, it's not lawful for their undocumented parent. And so I think there's been a lot of restriction here in Eagle County because of that policy that was leaked. People are afraid. People are just afraid right now. I mean, that's just how, and there's not, I mean, you can encourage them to still apply for the program because there's nothing untoward or unlawful about it as far as they're concerned, and then give them a Know Your Rights card just in case.
Hello, my name is Luc Meyer. I've been in this valley for 49 years. I came as an immigrant, and I'm a chef. I've been involved in restaurant. And my question is this: you haven't talked about the Q program. Why is that?
You mean the cultural Q visa? Do you guys use the Q visa here? The Q visa, it's an awesome visa classification. It's tough to use though, but it's for cultural uniqueness. When I'm teaching my class, I refer to it as the Epcot Center visa because it's like just based on who you are and who your nationality is. It's actually a great program. It's a little bit underutilized, but it's very limited in duration because you can only hold it for a short period of time. There was an awesome organization in Philly. It was kind of like a Chinese cultural awareness thing, and they would bring in a chef from a specific region in China to come and cook very traditional like the Chinese food we have here. You're laughing at me. It's not really Chinese food, right? Okay. So they would come in and they talk. And then the Q part of it would be this cultural aspect when then the chef would come out and through a translator would talk about what they just cooked and the ingredients that they used and stuff like that. There are culturally unique visas. There's also one called a P3. If Vail ever wants to have Mongolian throat singers come, I can get you a visa for that. Because it's culturally unique. So yeah, I mean, some of these cultural visas are good for very short purposes and periods of time, but the purpose with the Q is that you have to be providing the American culture exposure to a culture just based on what it is. So it's a little bit challenging to use in an employment context, but I do like it. Yeah.
Actually, and to your point, Vail Resorts did try to use the Q visa for ski instructors a few years ago. I can't remember exactly what year it was. I thought it was a great idea that the ski instructors would come and bring a little bit of their cultural perspective to the guests, and you might know more about this. We would learn more about their culture, but there was the visa itself was scrutinized very heavily by the Department of State, and they decided that the Q was not the ski instructor was not an appropriate use for the Q, and they revoked a bunch of visas. So it's been tried here, but it hasn't been successful.
So I'm a minority. I'm an old white guy. I worked corporately for 30 years. Most of my time has been overseas. Our time has come. The world is changing. We have borders. We have one easy border, you've got a real tough border. My frustration is most of the discussion tonight has been in the weeds, and I think it's fantastic. I've learned more tonight than I have in a long time. The general discussion out there is about Trump. It's about people coming across the border. It's about the wall. This is all emotional stuff. What I've heard tonight is there are practical issues. And everybody tonight has a different take on this. If you're a small business owner, you want more of the visas. Simple. There's a big body of people out there that don't want to work for whatever reason. And that's what's focusing the issue. So I'm trying to think to myself, what do I take away from this, and what can I do as a citizen? I think we have a responsibility to talk as lay people about immigration in a more of a holistic way. It's a problem for us. It's not unique to the United States. It's relatively new to the United States in its extremities. So my job is to talk to my kids, talk to my friends, get the issue of immigration out of the weeds and out of an emotional platform about what a jerk Donald Trump is or how you can't stand Nancy Pelosi. Unfortunately, our leaders are the most polarizing people in the whole wide world. I think we as individuals have to say to the younger generation coming up, you're going to inherit this. You're in a world that's dramatically changing, and it has specific issues and it has emotional issues. And you've got to be engaged, and you can't engage at the top. It's polarizing. Learn more about it. The schools, you know, the kids are learning Spanish. I had a young kid with me last night. He's 12 years old. He's speaking Spanish in the schools. We're doing a pretty good job of beginning to be sensitive to cultural differences at a very young age. I think we have to take immigration more holistically. There are lots of people out there. They're moving around. There's some specific issues that me as an individual have to be aware of, number one, and not make immigration a bad word. Because right now it's taking on all kinds of meanings to all different people. So I applaud you guys from being involved in this. I'm also very taken by the level of intelligence and the level of process that you're engaged with. We just got to get you guys out in the community and talk about some specifics here a little bit rather than the bloody emotions at the top. Thank you.
We had one up here as well after Raj, David.
Well,
Do you want to, wait, no, I don't have a response, but Claire has a response. We were having this conversation, this exact conversation prior to the panel.
My question is on the H-2B visa, since we and the state has got the highest needs and, you know, we're utilizing it the most. Between Gallegos and Vail Resorts and Eagle County, what is the stats, that number of H-2B visas is being, you know, utilized?
Utilized in Eagle County, I don't know, but if one of you would share the data, we have a handy takeaway for you that has exactly the answer to that, Raj.
Thanks, Amy. So I was telling Amy before the program tonight that I grew up in a border town. I grew up in El Paso. And for a big chunk of the 20th century, there was a cable car in El Paso that went between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. So effectively, it was an open border. And in fact, for a big chunk of the 20th century, it was an open border. So it seems to me this problem we have is a problem of our own creating, that we shut down that border, and people who used to come here and work and then go back down south to their culture, to their families, to their language, were stuck here. And they made a life here. But it seems to me it's a problem of our own making. So what I'm wondering is, why isn't the suggestion of an open border, an open economic and employment border, a valid suggestion? It's not like it hasn't happened in other parts of the world. It's happening in Europe pretty successfully.
Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, okay, so actually I'd like to address your point, and then it will actually dovetail into your point. And you raise actually like a very interesting issue, because we're all talking about the effect. Do we build a wall? Do we not build a wall? Do we keep these people in the country? Do we not keep these people in the country? But we're not talking about the cause of the problem. And honestly, like, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have jobs and there would be open borders. But the reality is we don't have a system that allows for year-round low-skilled visa classifications. And that's the root, in my opinion, of this entire problem. Like I said, 8 million of the 11 million people here without status are here because they want to work. But we don't provide any legal mechanism to do so. There's no dishwasher visa, right? There's no housekeeper visa. They don't exist. It's just not in our immigration system. So the talk of the wall, opening the borders, kicking them out, keep them there, that's all effect. But if you even if you make that move, you're going to continue to have immigration because of the economic driver. We need to create a mechanism if you want the solution. We have to create a mechanism for people to come here legally. We have to make it accessible to all employers, regardless of whether they can afford to hire an attorney or not. And then our enforcement efforts will have a real purpose. Because if we give you the tool, if we give you the status, and then you abuse it, there's no excuses. But we don't even give them the chance. So to me, if you want to take the discussion to the next level, or you want to eventually move to an open border, it has to start with addressing the cause and stop worrying about the effect. I hate to tell you, the jobs aren't coming back. If American companies come back to the United States, it's going to be done through automation. We have to educate, like you were talking about. That program sounds awesome. We got to educate the U.S. workforce. We got to focus in on the schools and the STEM and all that jazz. But to think like by putting up a wall or raising tariffs or whatever it is, you're going to have all these companies flocking back and then they're going to hire all these sort of blue-collar jobs. It's just not the way it's going to be. So we have to adjust in the next century, and I think that that's kind of the point there.
I agree with you 100%. Go, Jonathan! And I'm going to raise it an even higher level, which is beyond scope of this panel, that I think that today in our world, we are having issues of nationalism. And I think that's happening here in the United States, and I think that's happening in Europe. I think it's happening in the Middle East. I think that's kind of the larger conversation. What does it mean to be an American? How do we assimilate people? How do we not assimilate people? And I think that conversation is worth having, maybe not this evening, as we talk about immigration, because I think immigration has become sort of a buzzword or a dirty word for that larger focus.
I think that would be a great thing for the summer session starting on
I
June
was just gonna,
6th. If
I
you
was
guys
going
all
to
want
say
to come
that
back.
nationalism is a future topic for the symposium. So you asked a question and you got work. How about that? David.
My name's Dave Williams. I'm a local freelance journalist, and I would love to hear some responses to what you mentioned, the economics of companies actually moving jobs to the north of the border, not being reported. I happen to think that Trump's use of undocumented workers, which you mentioned, has been underreported. I mean, the Times and the Post did do stories, but it hasn't been picked up as a major thread. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's also used H-2B visa workers at his hotels. So I'm the rare journalist who has actually written about H-2B visas. I wrote before the recession, I wrote about it. I've recently, in 2017, I did a story on the ski industry being somewhat optimistic, NSAA and others, Colorado Ski Country, they were going to Washington. Because of Trump's background in running resorts, that he was very optimistic that things would happen. Correct me if I'm wrong again, this narrative, there was actually a deal pretty close last year on the wall. Schumer was going to give $25 billion. And I think the hang-up was actually over legal immigration with the desire to cut legal immigration. I'm wondering, talk about the Stephen Miller effect that's going on right now. Is that kind of what's really? It seems as if Trump would be willing to work on some of this stuff, at least from an economic endpoint. And then tell me some other stories that journalists should be covering and how we should be covering them. And do all that in the next 30 minutes.
Right on. I'll give you the nickel tour of that whole series of events. So in January of 2018, Trump had said 2 months beforehand that we're going to close the DACA program on March 18th. And there was a flurry of activity in Congress. He even got on and said, I trust the senators and the congressmen to come up with the best system possible. And whatever they come up with, I'm going to agree to. That was like a quote he said. And ultimately, they came forward with this plan that was pretty much we'll give you the money for the wall if you create a pathway to status, permanent status, not citizenship for the DACA people, and also protect TPS. Then they started horse trading a little bit on ending like the lottery program, the green card lottery, and there were some issues there. And then Trump came back and just changed his position completely, and I wouldn't be surprised if Stephen Miller was behind that slightly. But what's funny about that whole thing is Congress may have acted well before the whole government shutdown we had this past January, but there was an injunction by the courts saying that you can't end DACA, because there was a litigation. And once that was put in place, all the pressure was taken away from them to take a congressional action on it. So that's actually why it failed. It was, interestingly enough, coming to a head with this huge deadline, and that's what really forces Congress to act. And the court said, no, you can't end this program. The injunction was filed saying there would be irreparable harm. They agreed. So that took all the pressure off of Congress. In the same way that the creation of DACA itself during the Obama administration took the pressure off of Congress to do comprehensive immigration reform. So there's a lot of these outside factors. Like I alluded to earlier, the problem with executive orders, because it stops people from creating legislation that has a lifetime impact to it. As to your point about who's really pulling the strings and who's making the decisions, I don't know. I mean, like that first travel ban that came out in January right after he was elected, like that was written on the back of a Denny's menu by Stephen Miller and Bannon. Did you know that? No, I'm kidding. In crayon. No. But it's just like this willy-nilly policy that has no basis in law that they knew was going to be rejected. So a lot of their actions are done by this sort of shock and awe to kind of, and that was an actual quote from Bannon at the time, to say that we're here and this is what we're doing. Like they know full well that certain actions are going to be blocked through court litigation, but it's the action itself that motivates and galvanizes a certain percentage of the population. So I think that that's some of the issues that might be worth reporting. Here's a fun tidbit for you. The federal government just opened up something called the H-1B Employer Hub, which lists every single employer that has filed an H-1B. And you can search by state and by region and by company. Go look up the Trump organizations, and you'll see how often they utilize the immigration programs. It's very fascinating.
Wow. Okay, also to your point, which I can't remember now, I think that's part of that's part of the problem of this administration, and I don't mean to be offensive about the actual administration, but to my experience and our experience, we're not really sure what the policy is at any given moment, which makes things much more difficult. So we're going to have a deal on the border wall, and then DACA's going to get into play, and then the diversity lottery is going to go away, and then, oh no, wait, someone's talking in President Trump's ear about family migration, which he calls chain migration, and then everything stops because he has to find a way to not actually continue down a certain path, but to kind of keep everyone happy, which is not at all possible. And to your second point about Stephen Miller, I'd watch now what happens at DHS, because it's just a rumor, but the rumor is that he's kind of he's ascending and Nielsen's out, and DHS is going to be surrounded by people who are supportive of Miller's policies and the administration's policies.
One more question.
So my name is Brian Oliver Smith, and in 2015, our little company that had been a 6-year-old startup won a U.S. Commercial Services Award in North Carolina, one of 2 companies, because we did business in 50 countries around the globe. We ended up in 65. And so we used a ton of the H-1B. The interesting thing about this conversation, which I applaud the man behind me for bringing it up, is we have a bit of a tail wagging the dog. And a lot of that conversation is being distracted with immigration. And what's really being missed is that entrepreneurism right now in the United States is at an all-time low. We have dropped like a rock in the last 20 years. So we did a lot of H-1B visas, and Yoichi, who is one of my ones, and he came on, he now runs a company in California that employs 20 people. Irina, who we sponsored and brought on from Russia, she's up in Seattle and employs another 15 people. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up bringing people in and equipping them and teaching them how to be entrepreneurial in perspective and thought. And now they're employing, between just the 2 of them, about 50 Americans. We then went down to Guatemala. So I've seen the other side of it. We lived in Guatemala for 4 years, and I started to branch down there. And I saw what it takes to employ those people, and then we sold the company. But the interesting thing about it is right now we're getting our butts kicked by Africa and Asia. Africa is the #1 in the world for entrepreneurial ventures, and Asia is #2. And America has fallen to 3rd. We're not leading anything. And part of it is because of exactly what this young woman in front said, is it's really the tail wagging the dog. Economic opportunity drives where the jobs are, as this man pointed out, and as Vail Resort has, which drives more economic opportunity. And I think we have to get back to framing that opportunity versus a conversation of fear. And until we do that, we're going to have a decline, unfortunately. That's just a perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, out of the Fortune 100 companies, more than half of them are founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. There you go. In the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, they had a visa called the X visa. This is why I read the thing, to tell you about this. That was going to create a visa for people that had venture capital funding in excess of $200,000. They could get a visa to direct and develop their enterprise. Obama tried to accomplish it through executive order. He created a program called Entrepreneur in Residence. Trump canceled it. The real crime and shame of it is that we have so many people who come here as students and are willing to invest their money at a much higher premium than U.S. and permanent residents, and then we don't give them a mechanism to stay here. The Republicans in 2013 were saying, if you get a degree in STEM, we're going to staple a green card to your passport. You remember that? I mean, the rhetoric has completely changed. Completely changed. It was, and I think this is a good way to conclude it because it really brings it around full circle.
Yep.
There was a beautiful quote of Reagan when he was leaving office, where he was talking about the power of immigration and how it's the future of the United States. And of how there was one thing he wished he had done more in his administration was provide a mechanism for that growth and entrepreneurship through immigration. And he failed on that front. And like, I think we're still feeling it today because you're talking about 20 or 30 years later.
With that, thank you all for taking the time, and thank you to our panelists and speakers.
Thank you so much for your attendance. Always impressed by your questions. We can never solve the problems, but we love creating the dialogue and moving on to the next program. Be careful going home.